Detective Michael Harmon slammed his hand against the interrogation room table, his face flushed with frustration. The young man sitting across from him, disheveled curly hair, wearing a bright red t-shirt, merely smiled, his eyes reflecting not fear but satisfaction. "You know I did it," said Elliot Reed, his voice eerily calm. "But you'll never prove it." Harmon's jaw tightened. 26 hours of questioning, and the suspect hadn't broken. Worse, they had to release him in less than 2 hours due to lack of evidence. A brilliant young mathematician who had orchestrated the most methodical crime Harmon had encountered in his 15 years on the force. 3 people are dead, Reed. 3 innocent lives. Allegedly, Elliot replied, taking a sip from the paper cup in front of him. But as we've established, I was giving a lecture at the university when Professor Winters was killed. 52 witnesses and a live stream recording confirm it. He leaned forward, almost whispering, "The perfect alibi can't be broken, detective, not even by you." What Harmon didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that this moment of triumph for Elliot Reed would mark not the beginning of his freedom, but the first step on his path to destruction. Because perfect crimes, like perfect mathematical equations, only exist in theory, reality has a way of introducing variables that no one can account for. Not even a genius. Elliot Reed stood before the whiteboard in his cramped university office, scribbling equations with feverish intensity. At 28, he was the youngest tenured professor in the mathematics department's history, celebrated for his groundbreaking work in algorithm optimization. What his colleagues didn't realize was that Elliot's true passion lay not in academic recognition, but in solving the ultimate puzzle, committing the theoretically perfect crime. It had begun as an intellectual exercise, a mathematical problem to solve during sleepless nights. If one were to commit a murder, how would one create an unbreakable alibi? Elliot had no particular victim in mind when he started mapping the variables. It was purely theoretical, a mental challenge. Until Professor James Winters publicly humiliated him at the annual faculty symposium. Dr. Reed's work? Winters had announced to the gathered academics, while impressive for someone so young, fundamentally misunderstands the principles established in my own research 20 years ago. The laughter that followed had burned into Elliot's consciousness. Winters, the department chair and gatekeeper to the prestigious Fielding grant Elliot desperately needed to continue his research, had effectively destroyed his credibility in front of everyone who mattered in his field. That night, Elliot's theoretical exercise gained a focal point, but Winters was merely the catalyst. As Elliot dove deeper into his planning, he discovered something that transformed his academic vendetta into something far more intricate. While researching Winters' background for his plan, he uncovered financial records suggesting the professor was siphoning research funds into a private account. Further digging revealed 2 other faculty members were involved, Dr. Lisa Chen from computer science and Dr. Marcus Thompson from engineering. The perfect crime suddenly had 3 targets. Elliot's plan was elegant in its conception. Establish an alibi so concrete that even when the victims were connected to him, suspicion would be mathematically impossible. The key was to be in 2 places simultaneously, or at least to create the illusion of such impossibility. He began by carefully cataloging the routines of all 3 professors. Winters was a creature of habit, working late every Tuesday evening before walking home through the campus woods at precisely 9:15 p.m. Chen preferred early mornings in her private lab, arriving at 5:30 a.m. each Thursday before anyone else was on campus. Thompson was more variable, but had recently begun physical therapy for a knee injury every Monday at 4:00 p.m., taking the same route through the empty East Building afterward. Elliot calculated that he needed 6 months to perfect his plan to create a living algorithm where every variable was accounted for, every contingency planned for. What he didn't account for was Detective Michael Harmon. Professor Winters' body was discovered on a Wednesday morning, half hidden among the fallen leaves of the campus woods. The medical examiner determined death had occurred between 9:00 and 10:00 p.m. the previous evening. Cause of death: a precise blow to the back of the skull with a narrow, cylindrical object, possibly a hammer or pipe. Detective Harmon arrived at the scene as uniformed officers were still cordoning off the area. At 42, Harmon was known for his methodical approach and unusually high case closure rate. Where other detectives sought dramatic confessions, Harmon built cases on meticulous evidence collection and logical deduction. "Professor of Mathematics," Officer Jenkins informed him, reading from his notepad. "Department chair. Been at the university for over 20 years. "Any witnesses?" Harmon asked, studying the position of the body. "None so far. But there was a faculty event last night, some lecture series. Most of the department was there." Harmon nodded, making a mental note. "I want a list of everyone who attended, and everyone who didn't." Meanwhile, across campus, Elliot Reed was calmly teaching his morning differential equations class. When the news of Winter's death spread through the lecture hall, via whispered conversations and text messages, Elliot displayed an appropriate level of shock and grief. He even dismissed class early, citing the emotional impact of losing a mentor and friend. In the privacy of his office, however, he pulled out a small notebook and checked off the first item on a list. Phase 1 was complete. The algorithm was running. What Elliot didn't realize was that Detective Harmon had already flagged him as a person of interest, not because of any evidence, but because of standard procedure. In any academic murder, professional rivalries were always the first place to look. When Harmon first interviewed Elliot later that day, the detective found a young man apparently devastated by his colleague's death. "Professor Winters was a giant in our field," Elliot said, his voice carefully modulated to display the right mixture of admiration and grief. "We had our professional disagreements, but who doesn't in academia?" "Where were you last night between 9:00 and 10:00 p.m.? Harmon asked, watching Elliot's face closely. Elliot's expression registered mild surprise at being asked directly, but no fear. "I was giving a guest lecture for the Advanced Algorithm Society. It started at 8:30 and went until about 10:15. There were over 50 students and faculty members present." Harmon made a note. "We'll need to verify that." "Of course," Elliot replied with perfect composure. The lecture was also live-streamed and recorded for students who couldn't attend in person. "I believe the computer science department archives all those videos." It checked out, of course. Multiple witnesses confirmed Elliot's presence throughout the lecture. The video recording showed him continuously on stage from 8:30 p.m. until questions ended at 10:23 p.m. The case against Elliot Reed for the murder of James Winters was closed before it was ever officially opened. Exactly as he had planned. 1 month after Winters' death, Dr. Lisa Chen was found dead in her laboratory. Unlike Winters, whose death could have been staged as an accident or robbery gone wrong, Chen's murder was clinical and deliberate. She had been poisoned a synthetic compound added to her morning tea that left no trace in the body after 12 hours. The connection to Winters wasn't immediately obvious. Different method, different location, seemingly different motive. Chen had been in the middle of a groundbreaking project involving quantum computing algorithms work that would have brought significant funding and prestige to the university. But Harmon saw patterns where others didn't. 2 high-profile professors in related fields, killed within a month of each other. He told his partner, Detective Sofia Martinez. "That's not coincidence." "Chen's death looks like professional sabotage," Martinez countered. "Maybe a rival researcher, or even corporate espionage. Winters was more personal blunt force trauma. Body left to be found." Harmon shook his head. "There's something connecting them. We're just not seeing it yet." Their investigation led them to the discovery of the financial irregularities, the same ones Elliot had uncovered months earlier. Both Chen and Winters had received substantial deposits into offshore accounts, all traced back to a shell corporation called Nexus Innovations. When they interviewed Elliot about Chen, he appeared genuinely shocked by the news. "Dr. Chen and I weren't close," he explained. "Our fields overlapped occasionally, but we rarely collaborated." "Where were you Thursday morning between 5:00 and 6:00 a.m.? Harmon asked. Elliot smiled sadly. I was on a red-eye flight returning from a conference in Chicago. Landed at 5:45 a.m. You can check with the airline. Again, his alibi was airtight. Flight records confirmed Elliot had been on United Airlines Flight 1275, which landed at exactly 5:43 a.m. Security cameras at the airport showed him exiting the terminal at 6:12 a.m. It was physically impossible for him to have been in Dr. Chen's laboratory. Yet something about Reed's demeanor bothered Harmon. There was a calculated quality to his grief, a precision to his responses that felt rehearsed. "What do you know about Nexus Innovations?" Harmon asked suddenly. The question was designed to catch Elliot off guard, but the young professor didn't flinch. "Never heard of them. Is that relevant to Dr. Chen's death?" Harmon made a note without answering. "Thank you for your time, Professor Reed." As he left Elliot's office, Harmon couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. The alibis were too perfect, the timing too convenient. But without evidence, intuition was useless. 3 weeks later, Dr. Marcus Thompson was found dead in the hydrotherapy room of the university's physical therapy center. Electrocution apparently caused by a faulty equipment connection that sent a lethal current through the water. Now the pattern was undeniable. 3 professors, 3 different methods of murder, 3 perfect alibis for the one person Harmon suspected, connected them all. When they investigated Elliot's whereabouts during Thompson's death, they discovered he had been teaching a freshman calculus class, witnessed by over 200 students. The case was rapidly becoming the most frustrating of Harmon's career. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every suspect had an alibi. Every piece of evidence was circumstantial at best. Until they found the notebook. The breakthrough came not from detective work but from chance. A graduate student cleaning out Professor Winter's office found a small USB drive taped beneath his desk drawer. On it was a single encrypted file that, when finally accessed by the department's IT specialists, contained detailed records of the money transfers between Winters, Chen, Thompson, and Nexus Innovations. More importantly, it contained correspondence suggesting that all 3 professors had been blackmailing someone. The emails were cautiously worded, but referenced compensation for silence and evidence that would destroy your career. The target of the blackmail wasn't explicitly named, but one email mentioned the prodigy whose equation has a fatal flaw. Harmon immediately obtained a warrant to search Elliot Reed's home and office. In his apartment, hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of Principles of Mathematical Analysis, they found a small notebook. Inside were meticulous notes detailing schedules, locations, and methods. While never explicitly stating his intentions, the notebook essentially outlined the perfect murder algorithm complete with alibis and contingency plans. Most damning was a single page titled The Unbreakable Theorem, which listed the names Winters, Chen, and Thompson, each with a date next to them. The dates matched perfectly with their deaths. But even with this evidence, the case wasn't closed. The notebook outlined plans, not confessions, and Elliot still had perfect alibis for each murder. He couldn't have been in 2 places at once, Martinez argued during their case review. We have dozens of witnesses, video recordings, flight manifests. Unless he wasn't working alone, Harmon countered. They began investigating Elliot's known associates, focusing on graduate students who might be loyal enough to participate in his scheme. But each potential accomplice had their own alibis for at least one of the murders. The break came when Harmon, frustrated by the lack of progress, returned to first principles. "We're thinking about this wrong," he told Martinez. "We're looking for how he created perfect alibis. What if the alibis are real?" "Then he's innocent," Martinez replied. "Or," Harmon said slowly, "what if the murders happened before we think they did?" The theory was radical but mathematically sound. If Elliot had killed the professors hours or even days before their bodies were discovered, and then preserved them somehow until placing them during times when he had perfect alibis, the entire case would make sense. They re-examined the medical examiner's reports with this theory in mind. While the estimated times of death matched the alibis, the science of determining time of death wasn't perfect. Variables like temperature, environment, and preservation methods could significantly skew the estimates. Armed with this new perspective, they ordered new tests on trace evidence found on the victims. The results were conclusive. All three bodies showed microscopic evidence of having been stored at low temperatures after death and before discovery. Elliot hadn't defied the laws of physics to be in two places at once. He had manipulated the timeline itself. When they brought Elliot in for questioning, he maintained his composure. Even when confronted with the notebook and the new forensic evidence, he responded with the calm confidence of a mathematician discussing an abstract problem. "Interesting theory, Detective," he said after Harmon laid out the case against him. "But theories require proof, and you still can't place me at any crime scene during the actual time of death, whenever you now believe that to be." "The notebook is quite detailed, Professor Reed," Harmon countered. "Your mathematical approach to murder is almost admirable." Elliot smiled thinly. "Almost? You forgot to account for human variables. Blackmail victims keep records too." For 26 hours, they engaged in a psychological chess match. Elliot neither confessed nor requested a lawyer. He simply countered each of Harmon's moves with a calculated response. When presented with evidence, he offered alternative explanations. When confronted with motive, he presented reasonable doubt. "They discovered that my breakthrough algorithm contained a fundamental error," Elliot finally admitted during hour 25. "Instead of allowing me to correct it, they threatened to expose me. Everything I'd built would have been destroyed. My career, my reputation, my future." "So you killed them," Harmon stated flatly. "I'm saying they had motive to lie about me," Elliot replied carefully. "Any plans in that notebook were merely theoretical exercises, thought experiments about perfect crimes. I'm a mathematician. Solving impossible problems is what I do." As the mandatory 48-hour detention period neared its end, Harmon knew they didn't have enough for charges that would stick. The evidence was circumstantial, the timeline theories unproven. Elliot's alibis, while suspicious in their perfection, were still legally valid. "You know I did it," Elliot said during their final confrontation. "But you'll never prove it." Harmon had no choice but to release him. Elliot Reed returned to his life, seemingly vindicated. The university placed him on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. But with no criminal charges filed, his legal position remained secure. He even gave interviews to scientific journals about being wrongfully targeted because of professional jealousy and his youth. He began work on a new paper, Probability Matrices in Legal Evidence Standards, a thinly veiled mathematical breakdown of how he had beaten the system. What Elliot failed to understand was that Detective Harmon wasn't bound by the same rules as the justice system. While the courts required proof beyond reasonable doubt, Harmon's personal conviction needed no such standard. And he had become convinced that Elliot Reed was not only guilty, but dangerous, a man who saw murder as merely an intellectual challenge. Harmon began his own surveillance of Elliot, officially off the books. He watched him return to his routines, observed him beginning to formulate what appeared to be a new project in his notebooks. Most concerning, he noticed Elliot researching another professor, Dr. Sarah Jameson, who had recently published a devastating critique of Elliot's work. Unable to legally intervene, Harmon made a decision that would end his career if discovered. He anonymously sent the notebook evidence to Winter's adult son, along with detailed explanations of how Elliot had manipulated the investigation. 3 days later, as Elliot was leaving his apartment, a car accelerated toward him from across the street. Elliot, always observant of his surroundings, a habit formed during months of planning murder, saw the vehicle and the driver's intent in time to react. He lunged out of the car's path, avoiding impact by inches. But in his calculations to avoid the car, Elliot failed to account for his position relative to the street's steep embankment. His momentum carried him over the edge, sending him tumbling down the concrete slope. The fall wasn't particularly high, normally survivable with minor injuries. What Elliot couldn't have known was that the mathematical probability of landing at precisely the angle that would snap his neck was approximately 1 in 73,000, a statistical anomaly, an outlier on the bell curve of possibility. He died instantly, his body coming to rest at the bottom of the embankment, in a position that any observer would recognize as the result of a tragic accidental failed attempt to avoid being hit by a reckless driver who never stopped. Detective Harmon arrived at the scene 40 minutes later, having been alerted by the patrol officer who recognized the victim's name. As he stood looking down at Elliot Reed's body, he felt no satisfaction, only a hollow confirmation that justice operated by its own mathematics equations too complex for even the most brilliant mind to solve completely. The driver of the car was never identified. Winter's son had an alibi, was in a different state when Elliot died. The case was classified as an accidental death resulting from an attempted hit-and-run by an unknown perpetrator. 6 months later, Harmon resigned from the police force. His final case report on the 3 professors' murders remained officially unsolved, but he included a note in the file: some equations balance themselves. In his apartment that night, he burned the only copy of his unofficial surveillance logs. As he watched the papers curl and blacken in the flame, he wondered if Elliot Reed, in his final moment of realization as he fell, had appreciated the mathematical elegance of how perfectly his story had come full circle. The perfect alibi, undone by imperfect chance, the ultimate variable that no algorithm could account for. 1 year after Elliot Reed's death, a small package arrived at Detective Harmon's new home in a different city. Inside was a USB drive and a note that read simply, "The Final Theorem." The drive contained a single videophilia recording made by Elliot himself, detailing exactly how he had committed each murder, preserved the bodies, and placed them to create his perfect alibis. It was both confession and boast, the work of a mind that couldn't bear for its greatest achievement to go unrecognized. The timestamp on the video showed it had been recorded the day before Elliot's death. Harmon watched it once, then destroyed the drive. Some equations, he decided, were better left unsolved. But in the darkest hours of certain nights, he still finds himself wondering about those final statistics, the precise angle of Elliot's fall, the exact force required to break a human neck, the mathematical probability of such a perfect accident. And sometimes, in those moments, he could swear he hears Elliot Reed's voice whispering from the shadows, "The perfect crime isn't getting away with murder, detective. It's making sure justice looks like chance." Perhaps, in the end, both men had solved the same equation just from opposite sides of the blackboard.